and he flowed in it. I could tell you so many stories that I saw happen firsthand where in an undeniable way God worked through that man's life. And it was proof to me as a young man to hold true to God, because there was really real people of God in the world. I don't know what would have happened to me when I was a young man if the wrong preacher would have got a hold of me, or if I was going to the wrong church. I don't know what would have happened to me. But he was such an humble, powerful man of God that walked with God, and the supernatural was very evident in his life. And after his kids, of course, they were all raised and gone, and he took us in. He took me in just like his own son. He nicknamed me. I was with him all day long, just about it. I worked as a secretary for him. He called me a secretary. He paid me $15 a week out of his own salary. I learned later he didn't really need a secretary. He was just trying to help me and my mother and my sisters out because we couldn't pay the bills. But I remember being in those prayer meetings with him all those years. I didn't have a childhood, and I didn't have a teenage life like most kids. I was in church with him all the time. And we'd start about 7 o'clock at night, every single night. And Wednesday nights we had church, Sunday nights we had church, but we still came back and prayed after church. And I was with him for years without missing a single night, every night for years without missing a single night. And whenever you pray with someone like that for years, you're going to learn God. And you're going to learn the things of God. And I remember, friends, so many times things would happen in those prayer meetings that if I would tell you some of those things that even happen in prayer meetings, you probably wouldn't even believe them. You probably would not believe some of the things I could tell you. But one of the things I'm going to tell you real quickly, and I've touched on this before, but it's just so important to me, I never forget it. It's always on my mind. One of the things that set me off to talk like this tonight is I was watching Kenneth Hagin on TBN the other night with Marilyn Hickey. And he was sitting there talking about some of this stuff. And he said the Lord spoke to him years ago and said, I've raised you up to speak into this generation so that they won't forget the supernatural power of God. And as I was standing here tonight on the platform, the Lord spoke to me and he said, I have touched you and I've touched this church. And he said, tell these people some of these stories so that they won't forget the power of God in Brownsville and they won't forget the power of God in their life. And so I just want you to listen to several of them real quick. The pastor was going through a real problem. First time I'd ever seen a church problem in my life. It was a serious problem. It was a major church trouble. And coming from a home like I came from, it was devastating to me to see church people treat a preacher like that. Because we were in a revival in our church with an evangelist, and he was very handsome. He was very handsome, and he was very charismatic. He was a powerful preacher, man. I mean, the boy could preach the stars down. But pastor took a risk, and he called him in, and he said, son, I'm going to close this revival. We've been going on for about 6 or 8 weeks, and he said, I just sense something's wrong in your life. And he said, I'm going to close this revival down. And he said, I sense that if I let you go in this church, that something's not right in your life. I can't put my finger on it. But he said, if you keep getting behind this pulpit and spewing this on this church, he said, it's not going to be good. So he said, I'm going to close it out. I'm not going to tell the people why, but I'm going to close it out. And I was privy to all this information, but the church wasn't, because I was with my pastor. And when he closed the revival down, this young man went into the church and began to create trouble, stir up trouble. And matter of fact, it all resulted in a petition being circulated against our pastor to get rid of him. And I'll never forget, I saw that petition as a young man. I was 14 years old. And I remember I saw that petition, and I saw the names on that petition of some of our key church leaders to get rid of our pastor. And I remember thinking, if these church leaders just knew this man like I know this man, they would never sign a petition to oust him and to rebel against him. And whenever I saw their names on that petition, it broke my heart. And it did something to me. It hurt me deeply. And it made me real suspicious, to be honest with you. Because when I saw that petition and I saw this trying to get rid of him, they was actually trying to get rid of the most important person in my life. God had raised him up to salvage my life. And it hurt me deeply with these church people. So I remember that night we went out to eat at a restaurant, a little cafe, and the pastor said to us boys that night, he said, boys, I don't want to fight. He said, you know this petition is being circulated, and he said, I'm too old. I've been in the ministry too long. He said, I'm not going to resist this. I'm not going to fight it. And he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He said, there's a church that wants me in Winter Haven, Florida, and I've made up my mind I'm going to take it. And I'm just going to trust the Lord that they'll find another pastor here and move on, but I'm not going to stay here and be a problem. And man, when he said that, it broke my heart. It was just like somebody stuck a knife in my heart and just twisted it. Because I was going to lose my father, you might say, again. And I was losing the most important person in my life. And it was all over church. Again, church. And so I got a lump in my throat. I remember I just wanted to burst out crying. But I restrained myself because of my dignity. I didn't want him to see me crying. I didn't want him to feel bad, and I didn't want to embarrass myself. So I remember that night, I just got quiet at the table, and he tried to convince us that God would send us another pastor to love us boys and take time with us and pray with us like he did, but I knew nobody would do that. I knew it. And I didn't know what was going to happen to me. I was thinking to myself, I didn't know what was going to happen to me because he was my life. And I felt like with him leaving, he was walking out, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I felt like I was prey for the devil. So I remember that night we came back to the church, and I still felt like I was going to cry in a minute, and I didn't want people to see me cry. I didn't want him to hear me cry. So I sat out in the church in the dark. We always prayed in the dark. When we opened up the door, I came in and went and sat right in this area, right in here, in the dark, on a church pew. And I heard him up there, as we always did every night, fellowshipping with some of the other guys and some of the other men that got off on the third shift from the mills and the foundries. And I stayed out there because I still felt like I was going to cry. And I remember thinking to myself, boy, if I could just catch a bus. If the buses were just running this time of night, I'd go home. And then I thought, well, I'll just take out walking, but it was in a bad neighborhood, and it was a long way from our church to our home. So I said, well, if I walk, it's going to be too dangerous. And I remember Brother Wetzel, every time he'd get up to pray, he'd always pull his coat off, and he wore white shirts like I got on. And he'd always unbutton his sleeves and roll his sleeves up, and he'd undo his tie. And you could see him as he'd begin to disappear back toward the back pew, and he'd always pray at the back left pew in the back of the sanctuary. And he would disappear behind that pew back there, and after he'd disappear, you'd see that white shirt disappear. He'd be there for hours praying, sometimes groaning. You couldn't even understand what he was saying, just groaning like an animal. Sometimes you could hear him just mumbling to the Lord, talking, praying. Sometimes you could hear him praying out loud. But I'll never forget those sounds of those prayer meetings. As long as I live, I'll never forget those sounds of those prayer meetings. And I'll never forget this night. Never, as long as I live. I remember I saw 17, there were 17 of us in the prayer meeting that night, and I saw the men begin to mill around and pray. Matter of fact, the story that I'm telling you right now, my pastor came here to Brownsville before he died. He died in '89. He was in the old church across the street. He came over there and he validated the story. He told it with me standing right beside him in the pulpit. There was 17 of us in the church that night. I'll never forget it. And whenever they started walking around and praying, I tried to get up and pray, but the church was so thick with trouble, with church trouble. And also, my heart was so heavy from what he had told us that he's going to be leaving. I had two whammies against me. Number one was church trouble, and number two is he was leaving. I was devastated. Absolutely devastated. And so when I got up and walked around and tried to pray, I couldn't even pray. It's just like my words choked, and I couldn't even pray. And I remember I wasn't up probably 45 seconds, and I just went back and flopped down in the seat, pew. And I thought, my God, how can anybody pray in this place? And after I sat back down, the pastor never got up from praying at least an hour. He never got up. And after just a few minutes, maybe not 15, 20 minutes, I remember seeing his shirt rise up in the dark, and I saw him walk back toward the front of the building. And then all of a sudden I looked, and all the other men were up, and the young boys were up sitting on the altars in front of the church, and I was the only one left out there. And the prayer meeting had not gone long at all, maybe 15, 20